We are gathered here to pay our tribute to Professor K. N. Panikkar, a doyen of modern Indian history who passed away on the 9th of March 2026. He was among the stalwarts who contributed to the reputation of the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, as the leading department for research on Indian history across the world. Beginning his career in the University of Delhi after completing his PhD from Jaipur, Professor Panikkar was invited to join the Center for Historical Studies by the pioneers, Professors S. Gopal, Romila Thapar, Satish Chandra and Bipin Chandra, who were giving shape to a new and confident department for historical scholarship. Professor Panikkar initiated a new field of history, the social-cultural history of modern India, which took off quite successfully like many new areas that the Centre initiated. His course on the intellectual history of modern India gave a new orientation to social and cultural history, till then not taught in most universities in the country. Equally, his research and publications inspired generations of scholars. His address as the president of the Modern India section of the Indian History Congress in 1975 on India's social reform movement in the 19th century raised several important questions. For instance, I quote, what was the nature of the changes that had occurred in the 18th century and what was the intellectual tradition of that period? How did the intellectuals of the 19th century perceive the social, political and economic reality of their times? Did they have a vision of the future? And if they did, was it aimed simply at a rectification of traditions sanctified with the concept of golden past, or the maintenance of the status quo, or a total transformation? What were their programs and methods? What were the intellectual and ideological bases which helped them in perceiving the reality and in constructing the vision of the future? Finally, and perhaps more importantly, how did the specific political and economic situation, colonial domination, in which they function affect their ideas, programs and methods? Unquote. These issues raised by Professor Panikkar set the tone for the research contributions by those trained by him in particular and in CHS in general. While delivering his address as General President of the Indian History Congress, Professor Panikkar referred to the year 1975 when he had been Sectional President of Modern Indian History as representing one of the dark periods of modern India. I quote, when freedom of expression was curbed, civil liberties were suppressed, and democratic rights were denied, unquote. He recalled that behind the podium, lines from Rabindranath Tagore's inspiring poem, where the mind is without fear, and the head is held high, where knowledge is free. These lines were emblazoned. In 2008, when he presided as the General President of the Indian History Congress, he chose as his theme, culture as site of struggle. In other words, his was an academic commitment that was rooted to the questions of the present, addressing these through painstaking and rigorous research. Several scholars from the CHS have led the Indian History Congress, the largest body of professional historians in India, recognized for their academic achievements by being made presidents of the ancient, medieval or modern sections and nominated as general presidents. Each has shown courage in the stances they have taken through their own research and as part of the outreach of the Indian History Congress. Professor Panikkar was very much one such scholar. As someone who had the honor of serving as secretary of this august body and continuing to be a part of it, it is a matter of pride to see the strength and resilience that generations of scholars from the Center for Historical Studies have provided to the IHC and enables one to take on the responsibility with fortitude. Professor Panikkar's unabashed commitment to Marxism and progressive politics led him to take firm, sometimes unpopular stands. In fact, the first article of his that I read was the Damodaran Memorial Lecture, published in Social Scientists, which greatly influenced one's understanding of history and politics. After a nuanced discussion on Marx's views on religion, Professor Panikkar narrated a personal experience where his refusal to contribute and participate in a public celebration of Eid led to his being labelled a Hindu communalist by some. Shortly thereafter, he narrates, a group came to elicit support for a Hindu festival, which he again refused, again leading to his being targeted. He tongue-in-cheek remarked that given the accident of his birth as Hindu, he was not labelled as a specific communalist in this case. The important point he raised in this article was about how to propagate secular and democratic values in public institutions. And today, more so than ever, this is a question that should move all of us. The Center for Historical Studies expresses its deep sorrow at the passing of Professor Panikkar, while at the same time we wish to pay our respects to him by celebrating his achievements and contribution to the discipline of history and to the secular, democratic ethos of India that was so dear to his heart. On behalf of the Center for Historical Studies, I thank you all for being here, those who are in this room as well as those who have joined us online. I would particularly like to thank his daughters Ragini and Shalini for being here, and we express our heartfelt condolences to our chairperson, Professor Hiraman Tiwari, was supposed to join the meeting from outside. He's on a selection committee, but unfortunately he is unable to join us at the moment. So we, on his behalf, and of course all the faculty of the Center for Historical Studies, I thank you all for being here. I now would like to call upon Professor Romila Thapar, one of the founders of the Center for Historical Studies, who has joined us online, to say a few words.
Mr. K. N. Panikkar, better known to all of us as K, certainly to all of us in CHS, was a dear friend and an absolutely magnificent colleague. That is something that one does wish for when one starts a new institution, and we had it in full measure from him. He and I met first when I was at Delhi University, and I joined Delhi University in 1963, and Kane was teaching from an earlier period and was regarded as one of the finest teachers, quite rightly so. And then a group of us gathered, Professor Bipin Chandra, K.N., Professor Randeep Singh, and so on, and we were trying to introduce the idea of a new history. Why? Because the history that was being taught was really terribly out of date. And the new history that had gripped the world at that time, some of the best historians across the world were the practitioners of what was popularly called new history. The new history was really a move to try and move history away from Indology, which was simply a narrative of information and of factual evidence, towards the social sciences, where what was required was an analysis of historical material to determine the kinds of societies that existed in the past and what kind of links they had with us in the present. We were trying our best to change the Delhi University syllabus and make it a little more receptive to the new history. And so there were many discussions, many debates, many teachings. The arts faculty building room number 22 was alive with all this chatter that went on about what was meant and what we wanted. But only a trickle came through, because most of the people teaching history were perfectly happy with what they had been teaching for the last 30 years and had no desire to make any major changes. I was always struck in these meetings by the careful way in which Kane would explain what we meant by new history. What did we mean by social and economic history? What did we mean by the new dimensions that we were beginning to bring into the study of history? We would take up what he said and discuss it further. But the resistance to change was strong. We were really not able to make any great improvement in the syllabus and the reading lists. But we did make a few significant changes, largely bringing in some social and economic history, which made it easier later on to bring in the changes that Delhi University now has and grapples with. And then the big change happened. In 1970, JNU started organizing its teaching program. The School of Social Sciences was among the early ones to be established. There were 3 of us initially appointed to the Center for Historical Studies. There was Sarabali Gopal for contemporary history, and the notion of contemporary history was in itself quite revolutionary at that time. What was contemporary history? Isn't that a contradiction in terms, people say? And we had to argue opposition. And Satish Chandra taught or worked out a syllabus for medieval history, and I did the same for ancient history. But in 1971, there was a big departure in the CHS of JNU when people like Bipin Chandra joined us for modern history, and various other people were recruited, and we ended up with about a dozen faculty members at that time. KN was amongst those that came in at that period. And we were all teaching what we had specialized in, which was one thing, and we made a lot of difference to the quality of what was teaching by introducing these notions of new history. And we had long sessions from morning to evening where we would be thrashing out courses and syllabi and reading lists and arguing ourselves silly. But it was in fact extremely useful because it did make a difference to the general understanding of what we meant by history. We had to discuss what of this was relevant to us in starting a new department and moving history slowly away from Indology into the social sciences where it now abides. And there were many innovations we made which were completely new, and people sort of looked at us skeptically and said, will you find any students to come to you to learn about all of this? And of course, as it happened, the students that came to us and learned about all of this, the new history, were very excited, intellectually excited, and very intellectually provoked into thinking further, reading further, and discussing and debating further what was regarded as history. There were 3 innovations that we discussed, and Gail's participation was of tremendous help in just clarifying these innovations. We were working in a semester system, which meant that we could not have long survey courses that lasted through the year. We had to have shorter ones, 1 semester courses, which therefore focused on important themes and questions related to the history we were teaching. Secondly, we also felt that all students, no matter what specialization they chose, ancient or medieval or modern, had to be familiar with the differences that history indicated between time periods. What was the difference between ancient and medieval? Why did we make a distinction? This in itself was a very searching question, which had not been asked because the earlier distinctions were based on very little real historical analysis. They were based on time periods. And this kind of search introduced some comparative history from other parts of the world. And the themes in these were ancient society, for the ancient period, feudalism for the medieval period, capitalism and colonialism for the modern period. This was not actually laying down the law of these societies, but saying we could use these trends and these patterns to investigate what the pattern was in Indian history in different parts of the subcontinent. And that was very much the kind of approach we had. Is it viable to talk about ancient societies in a particular way? Is it viable to talk about feudalism covering the whole of the subcontinent? And what exactly were the issues behind the discussion of capitalism and colonialism? The discussion of these kinds of things widened the perception of history, and Kane's contribution was particularly helpful because he had worked on these kinds of courses himself and broadened the area by bringing in different parts of Asia and Europe. And this was, in fact, extremely helpful. The third innovation, which was really a completely new idea altogether, which I think, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken, was that we were the only university that introduced this course. It was called Historical Method. And what did we mean by this? It had never been considered by other universities, and it tried to answer the question, the very relevant questions that were coming up at this time, of how does one study and research history? And a lot of emphasis was put on comprehending and using the historical method. The historical method. This is something that is fundamentally different from the courses we had at JNU, from many other courses in other universities. And the centrality of using the historical method in studying history. What did this method mean? It meant familiarity with the method, which was a new feature, which was not being taught, and it was a major help to academic historians. Looking at things like sources, what is the evidence for proving that sources actually were reliable, that were being quoted? And how was the causal relationship between sources, events, and what happened put together? Was there a logic and rationality in the causal relationships? But prior to that, nobody had tested this. And finally, theories of explanation. What was the pattern that a society took in order to describe itself and be itself? And the theories of explanation were, of course, very fundamental to the changes of new history. Whilst all this was going on, we were recruiting students of all kinds from different levels of society, from different regions, different places. And in terms of personal relations, I was always very struck by the fact that Kane had immense empathy for students. He was always available for somebody to knock on his door and walk in and say, "Can you please explain this to me? I don't understand." And he was ready to do it, which very few teachers in universities are ready to do. And this was most helpful to students. It was a real asset for the CHS because we all then became much more informal with the students and really began to chat with them much more than we had done whilst we were at other universities where the relationships were more formal. Kane also had a lot of time for his colleagues. I remember that any time I had a problem with some aspect of modern history, doesn't matter how silly or stupid or how intelligent, I would go and see Kane and say, what do I do with this situation, or how do I understand this? And try and sort it out. And very often what I thought was going to be just a brief visit would become a long and interesting discussion on that aspect of history. And I certainly benefited a great deal from these casual conversations, as we call them. They were far from casual conversations. After retirement, Kane moved to Kerala, and I would always make sure to see him and Usha when I visited there, which was off and on. I liked going to Kerala very much, and I would go and visit. And I just liked being there, being with them, and being in that kind of ambiance. Gradually, however, his Parkinson's made him more and more indisposed. But he battled it very bravely. I mean, I've seldom seen people battling something, a disease, with such grit and courage. Of course, the passing away of Usha was a terrible blow for him because she was absolutely foundational, fundamental in her presence of being with him as the disease progressed. And I'd like to conclude simply by saying that his passing away has been a great blow to all of us who always looked forward to talking with him, even when he was indisposed at times, and not only on history, but in fact on life in general. And that's how I will always remember him. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thakur. Professor Harbans Mukhia, one of the stalwarts of the centre, is also with us online. I request Professor Mukhia to now address us.
Yes, am I audible? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Some and sad occasion, but also an occasion to not only commemorate but also celebrate our colleague, very valuable colleague, dear friend, and a neighbor on the NU campus. His contribution to not only to the evolution of the CHS itself, but also to the discipline of history as a whole. As has been mentioned by Romila and Mahalakshmi, CHS was established in 1970, 71, 72, faculty joined. First four of the leading lights joined Romila herself, as Gopal, Satish Chandra, Bipin Chandra, in quick succession. Then the next sort of run of historians joined K.N. Panikkar, as Bhattacharya, Suvir Jaiswal, Champal Lakshmi, myself, and so on. We joined in 70, 71. So anyway, the center got going in 70, 71, and 73. 72 was actually given entirely to the training of courses in the CHS, as Romila has explained in such detail. I think 1970s is a very exciting decade for the discipline of history in India, especially. It's a very exciting decade because down to independence, in fact, about a decade after independence, we were still sort of repeating the colonial history that had been handed down to us by the British regime. B.A. Smith's Oxford History of India was a standard textbook read by all of us. What was the level of we were doing BA, MA, whatever, from school onwards. B.A. Smith's Oxford History of India was the standard text. Very colonial, very justificatory of the colonial rule. But it followed, the history as a discipline in India was still following the periodization that James Mill had given to us. Although it had been rechristened James Mill had given the periodization to us as we know, Hindu period, Muslim period, and British period. That had been rechristened as ancient, medieval, and modern as early as 1903. But the basis of the periodization still remained the same Hindu period and Muslim period and British period. So we will continue with that down to something like 10 years, a decade after independence. The great intervention came with Marxist historians in the late 1950s and early 60s. A major door opened actually, a new window, a new door opened to the colonial history that we were studying, all of us were studying, had religious identity as the entry point into the study of Indian history. What Marxist historians did was they gave us an alternative entry point into the study of Indian history, the alternative entry point of class instead of religious category as the entry point. It was a major door opening. The work of first of A.R. Desai, who was a sociologist, his work, social background of Indian nationalism, but more than that, by professional historians like D.B. Koshambi in 1958, Irfan Habib in 1963, his majestic work, Agrarian System, R. Sharma's 1965 Indian Feudalism. These are the major works which opened a new door, as I said, they gave us an alternative entry point into history, which was alternative to the colonial entry point that we have operated with, that we have used for maybe 200 years or so. At least 150 years. But class at this time, the Marxist category of class at this time was still a kind of neat category, a bit too cogent, a bit too self-contained, a bit too sort of almost self-sufficient, in competition, complete in itself, and in competition with other complete categories of which it was an adversary. The capitalists and workers, the feudal lords and serfs or peasants or whatever. So that these categories were almost self-sufficient, and as I said, they were neat. And they were sort of, they didn't have many sort of considerations of differentiations within each class, and they didn't have any space for any intermediate space between the classes. They were always adversaries, competing at class struggle with each other all the time. So that there was nothing, no common space between them at all, in any way. So that, these were the first sort of major opening up of the disciplinary history through this major intervention, but it was still, as I said, a bit too, later on, one realizes it was a bit uncomfortable. It became a bit uncomfortable to realize that there were such self-contained categories. Class was it was entirely defined in terms of its economic dimension, one dimension, namely its economic dimension, namely its relationship with the means of production. A class is one who either owns the means of production, like the capitalist class or the feudal class, or it works on the means of production for the other class, for the master class, or the feudal, or the serfs or peasants or workers and so on. So that there was nothing, no intermediate space between them. This opening of the major door in the 1950s to 60s, particularly in 60s, it seems to me opened up many other doors. It was one major door, but it led to many other doors opening up, and that happened in the 1970s and 80s. That happened when great expansion of the scope of history took place. Great many new motives, new themes, new problematics were created or they evolved. New methods of looking at history, as Ramya was talking about. New databases, absolutely new databases began to emerge. And therefore, the real, I think, major shift, it seems to me, starting with late 50s, developing in the 1960s, but I think it really took place and very overwhelmingly in the 1970s and 60s and 80s, 70s and 80s in particular. And therefore, I look upon 1970s as a very significant decade in the evolution of our discipline in the Indian context. And it is this experimentation, new evolution, that was reflected in the discussions, in the structure of courses that happened in the CHS through discussions, quite clear of discussion of what courses, how to develop, what goes into them, etc., system of teaching, system of examination, bibliographies, and so on and so forth. It was a fascinating time. The discussions were absolutely marvelous, fascinating. We teachers learned as much from these discussions and the following and the teaching of these courses as from the students did. So I look upon I think 70s as a particular significant decade, not only for the CHS. It so happened that CHS came along in 1970s, but not only for the CHS, but for the discipline as a whole. And therefore, the discipline was 1980s onwards. It developed for 80s and 90s. It developed further. Marxism, as such, came under strain, some strain. It had to redefine or at least nuance itself from the almost crass kind of understanding of class as an economic category. It had to nuance itself and into other areas of life besides the economic area, besides the class level, and so on and so forth. So discipline was, and ever new themes were emerging, ever new courses were emerging, ever new perspectives were emerging. And in this, Kane, I particularly admire Kane's work. He started his work against land and state. That was one, but which was in terms of class. But he very soon, whether in CHS or on his own or before that, or I think after that, he evolved into a historian of culture. I particularly admire his lectures on science and culture. He was looking at science as culture, which was itself a very fascinating category, science as culture. We look upon these as antagonistic, at least separate from each other, if not antagonistic. But he looked upon science as culture, rather than one category, rather than So his Marxism was also evolving. As the discipline was evolving, he was also evolving, as we were all evolving. So it's a great, it was a great company that we had. It was, as Pamela has been saying, great to have conversation with him. He lived on the campus, I also lived on the campus, and therefore it was easy to walk over to each other's home and have discussions apart from coffee and so on. So it was a great company. He was a marvelous colleague. He was a great friend, and of course a very inspiring teacher. All his students were great admirers of him. They all greatly admired him, his teaching, and therefore one came to realize that he was one of the most significant members of the CHS faculty, CHS as a whole. So it's sad that such a valuable friend and colleague has passed away, but then he has left lots of legacy behind, lots to celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vidya. I now call upon Professor Aditya Mukherjee to say a few words.
I'm grateful to have this opportunity to say a few words about KM. As you know that we as students in the 70s were encouraged to call our teachers the Jeffers names. So we used to call him KM, but then Professor Gopal said that what is this KM? We should call him by his first name. So there was an experiment made to call him Narayan, which didn't work. So he eventually what stayed was KM. I would like to speak a bit about him in a personal way, not only as an eminent scholar and a committed activist, but as also as a mentor, a friend, a person with an enormous sense of humor, and so on. He joined, as Pamela said, in 1971, the year teaching started in CHS. So he was there right from the beginning. The same year that Vivula had also joined, and in 72 I joined as the first batch of students, MA students in JU. So from 72 till 1993, when he left to become the Vice Chancellor of the Sanskrit University.
You left in 2000.
Was it?
Yeah.
Was it 2000? Good for the answer. I know it was. It was a very long time that one had a almost day-to-day relationship with him. And just to tell you, younger people, what the atmosphere was in the 1970s, nobody in CHS had a car, except Professor Vipin Chandra and Professor Pamela Thapa. And Pamela Thapa used to stay in campus. And Professor Vipin Chandra's car, the students and faculty members were afraid to get in because occasionally they would have to get off and push the car because it would often not work. The rest of us had either cycles and at best a scooter, but most didn't even have that. Another thing about the 1970s was that there was only one telephone among the CHS faculty members, and that was in Professor Vipin Chandra. So if you had to make any urgent call or anything, or even call your girlfriend and give an excuse, you would all run to Professor Vipin Chandra's house. And there was only one black and white television, and that was in Professor Panikkar's house. So every few days, I think it was a week, every week, there used to be this Doordarshan program called Chitrahar, which is very popular. So we would all troop into his house I can sit and watch the whole program with endless amounts of coffee and snacks, etc. And then they were kind enough to persuade Vidula and I to stay on for dinner. So Professor Panikkar and his wife Usha were extremely generous people. They virtually adopted Vidula and I as a member of the family, and he treated me like a son. But like most sons, the sons occasionally rebel, which I did. And I must say to my eternal gratitude that we let that rebelliousness pass. And we were able to again bond with him in his later years, especially when he moved to Kerala. And we were able to visit him several times in Bangalore and in Trivandrum. He, as Ramila said, very bravely faced up to his illness, a Parkinson's which very rapidly advanced, but yet he would refuse to move out of what he thought was his Karmabhumi, Kerala. He would live alone even after Usha had passed away and not stay with his children, and easily must give a comfort. But he would rather stay where his roots were and his commitment lay. The good thing was he deserved to go peacefully, and I learned that he did. In the end was peaceful, even though his children could not be with him at the last minute. A lot has been spoken about his academic contribution. I'll just make a few comments. His first book is often not mentioned. So I might bring it to the notice of a lot of people who do not know about it. His first book was on British diplomacy in northern India, a study of the Delhi Residency, 1803-1857. It was a political history, a different kind of history than what he took up later on. But that is what he started with. And he graduated from Rajasthan and came here first to Hansraj College, and then he used to take classes in Delhi University, which many people, including Vidula, attended. And as said, that he was known as a very good teacher, and that is one reason why he was persuaded to come and join JNU. After coming here, within a few years, his second major work came out, Against Lord and State, Religion and Peasant Uprisings in Malabar, 1830s to 1921. That the book came out, I think, in 1972. And this was then followed by a number of works on culture, ideology, social consciousness, communalism, etc. One of the landmark books that I might want to mention here in this context was called Before the Night Falls, Forebodings of Fascism in India, which was published in January 2002, weeks before the Godhra uprising. And the book describes how the Sangh Parivar pursues a political and cultural program towards creating towards a fascist agenda. He was a fearless scholar, as you can make out from the way he wrote, but he was also an activist. He was a founder member of the organization called ANAR, that many of you would be familiar with. That is Act Now for Harmony and Democracy. That's what ANAR stands for. And he, Shabnam Hashmi, and Harsh Mandar were the founder members of this organization. And the organization, right from its beginning, took on the most difficult tasks. The first thing they did was to go and work in Gujarat after the Godhra massacres following the Godhra incident. The other areas they worked in was Kashmir. Apart from his activism and his scholarly work, he also, I think it must be mentioned that he took on the burden of being an administrator and did a wonderful job of that in Kerala. He was the chairperson of the Kerala Council for Historical Research. He was the He headed the Kerala Higher Education Council, and during his tenure, the entire effort that the NCERT was making, for example, as you're all aware of, trying to mess with our textbooks, a big resistance was put up by Kerala in their textbooks. They defied the communal pressures consistently, and Dr. Panikkar had played a major role in keeping education in Kerala on the right ways. So not an easy task. It is, as you can see, even now, not an easy task. And even in states where the BJP does not rule. Just the last few words on his teaching, and in fact, in the CHS, again, being fortunate to be among the first batch of students, we were showered with a lot of affection, time, energy, and of course, experiments. And the first experiment that was made on us was we used to have to write 16 tutorials per semester, which almost killed half the class. Many of them running to aims for mental health issues. It's a fact. You can check it out from your seniors. So then gradually, as you know, it was brought down to 12, and now it is half. But then it was a great experiment, and we learned a lot. I remember Dr. Panikkar was the first, used to teach 2 courses. Many of you don't know, he used to also teach China. He used to teach a course called Imperialism in China. And he taught a course at that time, initially called the Social and Religious Reforms in the 19th century, then the history of ideas, and eventually the intellectual history of modern India. And so some things that he taught at that time, we were young students, have stuck. And historiography since then has often built on these things. One of the things that he used to say, question, was this whole business of what he called the impact response model. The impact of the Enlightenment and the developments in Europe leading to reforms and change in ideas in India. He questioned that very frontally, giving us examples like the fact that Ram Mohan Roy, he would say that he wrote the major treatise that he wrote was before he learned English. It was based on his scholarship in Sanskrit and Persian. We get several examples to try and suggest the theme, which, as I said, has now become quite acceptable, that there are alternate routes to modernity. I think the notion that modernity only emerged from Europe, as you know, imperialism was one of the defenses of imperialism was this, that it brought modernity to the colonies. He questioned that, and scholarship since then has emerged. A lot of work has been done to show that it is complete rubbish to say that modernity necessarily had only one root, and that was the European one. The second big learning that we had at that time, which was a break for us, and particularly students like us who had, I was not a student of history like many others, but like Indiva, for example, he came from physics, I came from economics, so many people came from literature, Suchata came from economics, etc. So equal to the big learning for us to question what was clearly a Eurocentric view of the early modern period. That is, the 19th century being seen as a period where progress emerges after the dark 18th century. So colonialism brings in, again, not only wisdom but also all sorts of other benefits. Now this was very much a Eurocentric view, which was, as you know, has been pushed even by scholars like Eric Hobsbawm, who talk of the 19th century as the great breakthrough in world civilization, etc., etc. Whereas that was a century when the colonies, India and China, were really the noses were coming from the ground, and it was our worst century. The 18th century was our great century. India produced 8 times the GDP of the United Kingdom in the 18th century. What Panikkar was able to show was that it is not only the economic, that even in other spheres, in literature, art, culture, music, the 18th century was not a dark century. So that was something which was very new and fresh to us. and we learned, and just give you two examples of what we learned from it. I'd like to just end by saying that in his passing, we have lost a kind, generous, very brave person who stood up against any injustice that he came across very courageously. And I think if his students and colleagues, people with whom he worked his entire life, were to keep up this tradition of courage and fighting against what they know is wrong, his soul will perhaps rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Aditya Mukherjee. I do hope that our students who are sitting here realize how lucky they are. They don't have 16 tutorials to write anymore. And I want to invite Professor Mukherjee to say a few words.
Begin by thanking the Center for Historical Studies for taking the initiative to organize this memorial meeting in honor of Professor Panikkar, one of the founders and stalwarts of the center. It is only fitting that we should get together here today and collectively pay our tributes to him. But the days are such that one sometimes is very grateful for these sworn mercies, so I too wish to place on record my appreciation of the fact that we have done this. Much has been said about his academic and other achievements as a teacher, etc. So let me try and just fill in a few gaps, since we are recounting his life. Maybe some things which would be of interest to all of you but haven't so far been talked about. I would have, since I had, I'm perhaps the only person here who was taught by him in Delhi University. He was my teacher in 1970-71 in the second year of my master's program. Because we used to have the specialization, that is modern India, which I took, in the second year of the MA program, and came in as a teacher from Hansraj College, but who used to come in. The Delhi University had this custom, I think it still does, where teachers from colleges come and teach in the department. So he was one of those, along with Professor Vipin Chandra, who was of course there in the department, and others who I had the opportunity of studying from, and that was my first meeting with him. And I must say that he was a first-rate teacher, a very approachable person, and by the way, he did teach us political history, the book which Aditya mentioned, which is rarely talked about. And maybe I'm one of the very few people who's actually studied that book, I believe. And I can tell you it's a very fine piece of work. And as we now often go back to things which we thought were quite outdated some time ago, I think political history is coming back in. I think we would discover it's a very careful, meticulously researched piece of work for the first part of the 19th century, what the British were doing here, and focusing on the residency, a very careful look at the record. It's a very fine piece of work of the old style history of that time. He worked under one of the masters. So that was one I just wanted to tell you. But a little bit about his early years, which he often used to talk about. He was very rooted in Kerala. I do want to talk about that. He grew up in Panikkar and often talked at great length about his childhood and his youth. I don't know how many of you know that he was a very well-known student leader of the SFI in Kerala before he came to Rajasthan to do his masters. And he was a recognized and known orator in Malayalam. At that time, he was familiar with and knew on intimate terms the top leadership of the CPS, like EMS, for example, with whom he had personal. And I know that even when in early years, when he was in JNU, when he would write something, he would often send it to EMS. And there was a continuous communication between them. So he had this whole career, which in a sense got interrupted, a kind of student political activist career, because he came away to North India. And that was largely because at Rajasthan University he got a fellowship. So he came here to study, and then he stayed on for a PhD, and when he met his dear wife, Usha, she was a classmate. She's from Rajasthan, and then got married, and then came to Delhi and started teaching at the Hansraj College, and then from Hansraj College he came to AU. Interestingly, he and I joined the CHS virtually at the same time. I think probably the difference might have been a day or two, because our interviews, our selections took place either again on the same day or maybe 1 or 2 days here and there. So early June of 1972 is when we both joined the Center for Historical Studies, I as a very young lecturer, and Ken of course as an established scholar and senior teacher. And well, I must say that I would like to place on record that I was very fortunate in that I found in him a senior but a very good friend and mentor. Spent a lot of time with him, especially in the early days when we all had more time, at his house on the old campus, where he had moved in after joining the CHS. I don't know if you remember, there were those, in the old campus, there was those few houses. It was not in the blocks, hostel blocks, but these were behind that. So there were separate flats over there, and he moved in over there, and often in the evening after classes, we would walk across, and that's how I got to know Usha and Shalini, little Shalini, and little older Ragi. I also want, before I go on to a few other things, I also want to tell you some other things about him as a person. I don't know again how many of you knew that he was a painter. And in fact, in his study in the JNU house, there was a canvas, and often he would do that for days on end. He was very fond of painting. And then I don't know how many of you know that he was a writer in Malayalam. So there were many aspects to his personality, and because he was on the whole a quiet man, somebody who was not garrulous in the sense like many of us talk nicely to the person that we make sure everybody knows what we are doing. You have to spend quite long hours in congenial circumstances, perhaps over his favorite scotch, where he would then open up and talk about his past, his childhood, his family, and things that mattered to him. And I was fortunate enough to have been in many of those conversations, and I value that relationship very much. Also wanted to, since I'm on this, that he really, another aspect was that he loved the good things of life. As I said, he loved good scotch, he loved good cheese, salamis, good fish, good mutton, and so he was somebody who, he was not an ascetic. He was a quiet person, I said, but he was not somebody who did not enjoy the good things of life, and I think that was what made him such a multitude-rich personality. Of course, with his students, he was a wonderful. I know from many of his students, he helped them in all kinds of ways, which one will, which don't need even mention, not just emotionally, academically, of course, but emotionally, sometimes financially. He also supported large numbers of members from his family who used to come and be with him in Delhi. So he had very strong roots continue to have strong roots with him. And also, I mustn't forget this, talking about the Malayalam part. I don't know again how many of you know, because I've not seen it mentioned anywhere in the write-ups, that just a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, he wrote his autobiography in Malayalam. And in fact, when we last visited him in Trivandrum, it was probably a 1.5 years ago, he showed us his autobiography, and I was very happy to see that there was a photograph in that in which I was there. So he had cared enough to have a photograph in which I was there. Rather flattered. So, all these things about him, I mean, and probably that's the last book he wrote, which is in Malayalam. And again, I also want to say that when we are talking about his academic interests, because he spent, of course, and that was one of the major contributions he made was on bringing intellectual and cultural history into the mainstream of discussion, but his Malabar book gets left out, except it's mentioned, but the significance of that. And since I was working on peasant struggles and agrarian structure and all that, this was a common area that we shared, and we would often talk about it. That is the time that he was writing this book. So his perception, his understanding, I mean, I don't want to go into an analysis of what is there in the book, but actually, and today when actually the politically speaking, the Mapla rebels have been thrown out of the annals of the freedom fighters, I think his book is very important politically as well. I mean, you know that this has happened. So I think, there are a lot of very interesting aspects to his work. As I said, the early work, the peasant movement, the peasant structure work, and also, otherwise also, there are, which he edited, but he was very strongly rooted in studies on Kerala. So there's a regional history, strong dimension of focusing on regional history, and he had the great advantage of knowing the language well. So once he went back to Kerala in 2000, and as you know, he was first Vice Chancellor, founding Vice Chancellor of the Sanskrit University, and though I named it as Sanskrit, but it's actually a broad-based university. It's set up as a very fine university, just a little bit away from Kochi. And then, as Aditya mentioned, he was founder chairman of the KCHR, the Kerala Council for Historical Research. Then the Higher Education Council again, he headed for many years. So he played a very important role in promoting studies, scientific, sophisticated studies into Kerala. So his contribution to the regional history of Kerala is also something that we need to remember. I'm not going to repeat anything about his work in the field of intellectual and cultural history. Aditya stole all my stories about only TV and only cars, so I wouldn't repeat them. Except the fact that he forgot that the Sunday movies were also something that his house was invaded for, apart from the Chitrahat. There were 2 evenings a week when Professor Panikkar's house was invaded to watch good old days of Doordarshan. Okay. The one thing that I want to put on the table, many contributions, but I recall vividly, again, it's academic stroke political, when the Babri Masjid incident, etc., was that whole phase, and when the center got together to bring out that pamphlet on the whole issue, Panikkar played a leading role in that. I think it was also that he happened to be the chairperson at that time, if I'm not mistaken. We all were signatories, but he played a leading role in putting all that together, and which stated, in a sense, the position. I think there was only one person who didn't sign, so we didn't put it out as a center's statement. So it was a signed statement by everybody in the center, one or two, whatever. And that was, I think, a very, very important academic stroke political intervention, because clearly the whole Babri Masjid Ram Janmabhoomi issue, the demolition, everything has been a major, major turning point in Indian history. And that the Center for Historical Studies played some role. And that Panikkar was in the middle of it and leading it, I think something we need to put down. Out of that then came the book, the larger book of, which was the Anatomy of an Anatomy of a Confrontation, which was edited by Escobar, in which the first piece is this. So I did want to, I just thought I'll fill in some of the gaps and not repeat what everybody has said. I would like to use this opportunity, since Shalini and Ravinia were here, to express on all our behalf our condolences, as well as say that they can be proud that their father was such a wonderful man, such a wonderful teacher, such a fine scholar, and somebody who's remembered with such affection and warmth by so many, as was their mother. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brinda Mukherjee.